Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Protein in Diabetes and Weight Management. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, publishers of today's Dietitian, and I'm the host for today's show. Before we get started, I have 3 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your CPE credit, you'll have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenter will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it in the comments box on the left side of your screen, and we'll try to address as many questions as time allows. Finally, Heartland Food Products Group number 22971 is approved by the CDR to offer 1 CEU for this webinar. Based outside of Indianapolis, Heartland Food Products Group is a global leader in the production of low-calorie sweetener products, creamers, beverage concentrates, coffee, and nutritional drinks made in the USA. They actively support healthcare professionals in counseling clients to reduce added sugar, manage weight and diabetes, and live an overall healthier lifestyle. Learn more at heartlandfpg.com. Finally, today's presenter has the following relevant disclosure to report. Holly Moran is employed by Heartland Food Products Group, maker of Splenda brand products. And so with that, let's get started. Holly Moran, MS, RD, LD, CDCES, joined Heartland Food Products Group in 2021 and currently holds the role of Manager, Nutrition and Science Communications. She has a bachelor's degree in dietetics and a master's degree in communication with a concentration in health communication, both from Purdue University. Previously, Holly worked as a diabetes educator for one of the largest adult diabetes and endocrinology practices in Indiana. A strong family history of diabetes drew her to specializing in the disease. In her free time, Holly hosts theme parties and game nights with her husband and cares for community cats in her neighborhood. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over now to my friend, Holly Moran. Welcome, Holly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks to everyone for joining me this afternoon. We've got a lot packed into this presentation, so let's get started. We're going to quickly go over these learning objectives for today. So following the webinar, we would like you to better be able to recommend types of proteins and intake amounts to your patients who have diabetes and weight management goals, and this is based on the latest protein guidelines. And then also explain how protein affects different diabetes and weight-related measures. And then also be able to identify different types of proteins and their sources and the current trends in protein intake. And then finally, we're going to be discussing nutrition shakes and how your patients can use those for supplemental or substituted protein intake. So let's kick it off with those current protein recommendations. So while we're all familiar with the DRIs, or the dietary reference intakes, let's review, because I think this would be a good spot for reviewing that. So the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance for protein, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And this is based on the recommendation of high quality protein. However, in the DRIs, they don't technically define what high quality is. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, though. And then the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or AMDR for protein, is 10 to 35% of total calories. So let's look at some things that you want to probably be remembering about the DRIs. So keep in mind that DRIs are for the general adult population. So it's not for people who may be nutrient deficient or malnourished due to disease or illness. This is for that general population. Also, they reflect the average daily intake over time. So we definitely recognize as nutrition professionals that no one's going to be eating the exact same foods in the exact same amounts every day. And that goes for protein as well. So this is reflective of that average daily intake of protein over time. And then keep in mind also that the RDA is the minimum, but not necessarily the optimum recommendation. So the 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day, that is simply to prevent protein deficiency, but not necessarily for optimal benefits. So let's look at what MyPlate says. So the MyPlate recommendation is more in accord with the AMDR than it is the RDA. And it is consistent with the typical or usual protein intake in the United States, which in this particular source, they stated 13 to 16% of total calories. So along with this, the dietary guidelines in MyPlate, they give some guidance on protein intake. So they recommend eating a variety of protein foods, that meat or animal-based protein choices be lean, and that seafood or fish options be higher in omega-3s, lower in mercury. And then finally, they also give guidance on vegetarian or plant-based protein options, such as beans and peas and lentils. So now let's take a look at these different recommendations head-to-head, the RDA, the AMDR, and MyPlate. So obviously, there's different calculations and formulas for these. For RDA, you simply need someone's weight in kilograms, whereas AMDR, you need to understand what their daily calorie goal is. And for MyPlate, there's not necessarily a formula. There probably is on the back end. But if you go to myplate.gov and use their calculator, you simply input the calorie goal and age, and then it will give you recommendations based on the food groups. And so I use an example here of a protein recommendation for a 30-year-old male weighing 70 kilograms and aiming for 2,600 calories per day. And when you look at it head-to-head across these recommendations, the grams of protein is very different. So again, RDA is the minimum recommendation. So that 56 grams for this 30-year-old male is the minimum to prevent protein deficiency. Whereas with AMDR, it's higher with 65 to almost 228 grams a day. And then with MyPlate, it doesn't give the information in grams, but I did some calculations based on the food groups that was recommended, and it came to about 100 grams of protein for the day. So it is really important to understand the difference between these definitions of these recommendations so that you can make the best recommendations for your patient. So let's look at what the American Diabetes Association has to say about protein. So every year in January, the American Diabetes Association releases the standards of care. I didn't see a major difference from last year's standards of care to this year's in terms of protein. So what they're saying here is that there is no evidence that adjusting the daily level of protein intake, so they're stating that it's 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day, or 15 to 20% of calories. That's slightly different than that MyPlate resource I showed you. But they say going above this amount, there's no evidence that necessarily improve health. They also state that protein intake goals should be individualized. So ADA has taken an individualized approach since the 1990s. And of course, we should always be doing this with our patients because every one of our patients is different. But they do recognize the ADA that increasing protein slightly to that 20 to 30% range, that could contribute to satiety and therefore can help with weight management. So going further into the standards of care, the ADA also gives some guidance on those with chronic kidney disease. So they state that people who have diabetes and chronic kidney disease, they do not need to restrict their protein to less than the RDA of 0.8. I know that when I was in undergrad for dietetics, I learned that it was 0.6 for people who have chronic kidney disease and diabetes, but there's just not strong enough evidence to show that this truly helps, and so they recommend that you don't go below that 0.8 recommendation. So for people who are not on dialysis yet, sticking at about the RDA is what's recommended, that 0.8. And once someone is on dialysis, it is recommended that they take in higher levels of dietary protein. Now, the ADA here doesn't give specific numbers, but they recommend that because of the protein energy wasting that occurs from that dialysis treatment. So Joslin Diabetes also has some guidance on protein, and this is particularly for overweight and obese adults who have either type 2, prediabetes, or those who are just at higher risk for type 2. So they very much recognize that connection between overweight, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. And just keep in mind that more than 3 in 4 adults who has type 2 diabetes is overweight or obese. So they recognize that connection there. And so their guidance is similar to ADA's. So they say that protein intake should range from that 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram, but this time of adjusted body weight. So about 20 to 30% of total calories. They also, like ADA, recognize that increasing the protein intake slightly can reduce appetite, so therefore increase satiety, help with weight loss. And then they also state that it's not necessary to recommend anything above 2 grams per kilogram of adjusted body weight per day. And that you, just like ADA stated, don't go below that RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. as this may result in protein malnutrition. So now that we understand the recommendations for protein, let's take a look at how much people are actually consuming. So this study here explored the relationships between protein intake, diet quality, and functional limitations in over 23,000 U.S. adults. And these people were from the 2005 to 2016 NHANES. So they split the participants up into 3 groups based on their glycemic control level. So there was a non-diabetes group, a pre-diabetes group, and then a diabetes group. And they collected dietary information using a 24-hour dietary recall. And then the groups were categorized based on either meeting the RDA for protein or not meeting the RDA for protein. And so this is what they found. Of those 3 groups, the group with diabetes was least likely to meet the RDA for protein. Over half of them were not meeting the RDA, which I found really interesting. So let's look a little bit more at this study. So for all 3 groups, when they were not meeting the RDA for protein, it impacted their diet quality. So specifically, we're eating less calories, we're eating more carbs, we're eating more added sugars, and then they had a lower total healthy eating index score. So this was for all 3 groups. But what was unique for the diabetes group was that they had the lowest grip strength of all 3 of the groups. So they had more functional limitations or physical limitations. And they also had more trouble with stooping, crouching, and kneeling. So this very much supports studies that have been done to show that diabetes is associated with increased risk for sarcopenia or muscle loss. And I would say these findings also challenge the assumption that all Americans are getting plenty of protein. I've certainly heard this assumption before that, oh, in America, we don't really have a problem with protein. But clearly on the study, there are many people not meeting even the RDA with minimum recommendation. And we know medical nutrition therapy for diabetes is very much surrounded around carb intake because as this will help with glycemic control. But I would argue that we should be focusing a little bit more on protein because we see that this population is at higher risk for these functional limitations. So this is another study done in Canadians and Europeans, and they described longitudinal analyses from 4 population studies. So Canada, and there's 2 in the Netherlands and 1 in Finland. And they collected the dietary data in different ways depending on which study it was. There was either a food frequency questionnaire or they did a 3-day dietary record. And they analyzed the protein intake in terms of grams per kilogram body weight per day. And there was a lot of information in this study. I would encourage you to go through my references and find this study because I found it really interesting, but there was a lot and I couldn't pack it all into this one slide. But they analyzed incidence ratio, and essentially what they determined was that a higher protein intake was associated with a lower risk of prediabetes and diabetes in these populations. So now let's take a look at how protein affects different diabetes and weight-related measures. And we'll kick it off here with a little true or false question. So 50 to 60% of dietary protein is converted into blood glucose and enters the bloodstream 3 to 4 hours after consumption. Is this true? Is this false? Well, we know this is false. So this was a common misconception that is thought to have originated from a study that was conducted way back in the early 1900s. The authors of the study reported that 3.5 grams of glucose was produced from ingesting 6.25 grams of meat protein. And so they concluded that for every 100 grams of meat that someone consumes, it will produce 56 grams of glucose. But what we found with later studies that challenge this is that this is not true. So what we do know is that dietary protein actually has minimal effect on blood glucose. And in fact, it can act as an insulin secretagogue, so meaning it can help stimulate insulin secretion to reduce the blood glucose response to carbs that are ingested. So I have a little animation to show you here. So we have chicken to represent the protein and an apple to represent carbs. And when this is ingested, we know that carbohydrate breaks down to glucose, enters the bloodstream, and that's going to stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. But at the same time, or as they said, synergistically, the protein is also going to be stimulating that insulin response. So even in the ADA standards of care, they have a statement on this that says in individuals with type 2 diabetes, ingested protein appears to increase insulin response without increasing plasma glucose concentration. So that's why they recommend that when a person's treating low blood sugars, that they don't have a carb that has protein in it, because that's not going to help them get their blood sugar back up, right? So we also have to keep in mind that this process here, as stated by the standards of care, is that this is for people who are still making insulin, like potentially people with type 2 who are still making insulin, people with prediabetes, and people who don't have diabetes. And someone who doesn't make insulin, obviously this process would not occur the same way. So let's look at how it does happen in somebody who has type 1 diabetes or cannot make insulin. So this year was a randomized crossover trial. It wasn't a huge study. It was around 30 participants in the study, and all of them were on intensive insulin therapy for their type 1 diabetes. And they consumed different types of drinks. So the control group, they drank just water. Then there was some people, and they did do a crossover with this, but there was a group that drank a glucose drink. And then there was a group who drank just pure protein drinks. And then they measured the glucose response to these drinks. So as expected, the glucose drink raised glucose levels. So they did not give insulin to these participants because they wanted to see how the natural reaction was in the body to having this drink. And they found that the 20-gram drink in particular caused the biggest rise or peak from obviously from the drink itself. But with the protein drink, what was interesting was it was just the 75-gram and the 100-gram protein drinks that caused a significant rise in glucose. But this was only at the 3 to 5 hour mark, which the glucose drink, it had a much earlier peak. And with the protein drink, it was basically a more delayed and sustained response. So like I would like to kind of think of that as like a flatter response, but it was still significant. And the researchers think this is potentially due to gluconeogenesis. So if that takes us back to our biochem days. So remember, gluconeogenesis is when the body makes glucose from non-carb substances like amino acids, which come from protein. So I think that that's possibly what can explain what happened here. And there are other studies that have shown that this happens when ingesting high amounts of protein. It does impact glucose levels. So even in the ADA standards of care, they say that there may be a need for additional insulin coverage when someone's consuming a high protein meal. I had some patients that read about this, I remember, and they're the ones that are really savvy, the ones that like to ask a lot of those tough questions, and where they would ask me things like, oh, I heard that, that I might need to take extra insulin for protein. Like, how much should I be taking? Should I be doing this? And I think there's just a lot that you have to really consider if you're going to be making that recommendation for taking insulin for protein. So factors to consider are, how is your patient even monitoring their glucose levels? Are they using a meter? How often are they monitoring? Are they using a CGM? So are they monitoring all the time? What type of insulin are they taking? If they're not on mealtime insulin, then obviously they can't dose for protein. And then what is their method of insulin delivery? So if somebody's on an insulin pump, they can be a lot more particular about how they can dose for protein, because there's certain settings on pumps, like sometimes they're called the dual wave feature, and they can be able to have the insulin release more slowly for the protein meals than they would for the higher carb meals. Also, food literacy, numeracy, and then interest and capability you have to consider. So if you have a patient that is struggling to even count carbs, they are certainly likely not going to be able to dose for protein, because this is definitely a more complicated, higher level way of dosing. So now I'm going to pivot here. This is something that's hot off the press. I just read this in my latest edition of the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. It's the March edition. And the Academy updated their guidance on adult weight management. The last time this guidance was updated was back in 2014, and obviously a lot of research has happened over these years. So an overarching theme that I saw with this guidance is that there's an emphasis on shared decision-making with your patient, and so having a patient-centered approach. And included in this article, they did provide a bunch of dietary approaches that adults who have overweight and obesity can consider using. And so I pulled some of these that relate more to the topic that we're covering today, protein. So a couple of the diets that they had in there, they had a higher protein diet, which is 25% of calories from protein. And then they had a zone type diet in there, which is 30% of calories from protein. And then they had a moderate protein diet, which is 12% of calories from protein. And then they also had meal replacement in there. And we're going to be talking about meal replacements later on in this presentation, so I wanted to throw that one in there. So while we're on the topic of high protein diets, I wanted to look at how some of these popular ones compare to the USDA recommendations, particularly the AMDR. So I listed here Atkins, Keto, South Beach, and then the Zone diet. So you can see here that the percent protein, pretty much for all of these except for South Beach, fall within the AMDR. They're just a little bit more on that higher end of the range. Except for keto, that seems to have the least amount of protein, but I like to think of keto diet as more of like a high fat diet. You know, in some instances you see higher levels of protein in that diet, but it's definitely more focused on the fat. So I thought this was interesting to look at and just see how these diets compare and their protein recommendations. So to be clear, there's no set definition on what a high protein diet is. I've seen some literature that says a high protein diet could be anything that's above the RDA of 0.8, which I think is pretty modest. But it's theorized that higher concentration, higher protein diets do contribute to satiety and thus can promote weight loss. So that's why they're recommended for weight loss. So let's look at some of those mechanisms behind that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this on the subsequent slides, but increased secretion of satiety hormones, that's believed to be a mechanism. Reduced ghrelin secretion, so the hunger hormone. Also, protein has an increased thermic effect of food, which we'll talk about. And then elevated concentrations of plasma amino acids. So it's proposed that having higher levels of amino acids in our blood produces greater feelings of satiety. And then also the protein-induced alterations in gluconeogenesis. So it's thought that that gluconeogenesis that helps maintain our plasma glucose levels and thereby can help with satiety. And then finally, we have preservation of lean body mass. So when someone is trying to lose weight, they may also be trying to gain muscle mass, and increasing protein in the diet can assist with that. So while there are mechanisms, there are caveats to a high protein diet. So such as when someone is limiting carbs in their diet because they're increasing protein, they're going to be taking in less of those key nutrients that can be in carb foods like fiber, and I think of a lot of those fortified nutrients like B vitamins. Also, there's increased acid load to the kidneys. So while higher protein diets do not necessarily hurt or affect somebody who is a healthy individual, for someone who does have that chronic kidney disease, this increased acid load to the kidneys may not be a good thing for them. Also, increased risk of kidney stone formation. And then if someone is on a higher protein diet and they're consuming more animal proteins, it can increase their risk for higher cholesterol. And then also possible increased risk for type 2 diabetes. So there were a couple of studies that correlated increased risk for type 2 with increased protein intake. Not entirely sure on the mechanism behind that. One of the studies proposed it was because if you're consuming more red meat, it might increase risk for type 2, but the jury's still out on that. So I would put a question mark there. So let's look a little bit more, like I said, at those satiety and hunger hormones. So increased protein intake can lead to increases in GLP-1, CCK, and PYY, which are our satiety hormones. So when protein is ingested and these hormones get released, the vagus nerve in our body is also stimulated. So this is the nerve that's tied to digestion in our body. And so therefore, this is what's proposed can lead to that decreased food intake or increased feelings of satiety. Also, protein intake leads to a reduction in ghrelin, which is that hunger hormone. And like I said, I was going to come back to talk about thermic effect of food. So as a reminder, this is when we have increased energy expenditure that results from processing nutrients in our body. So like digestion, absorption, transport, metabolism, and storage. So essentially the calories that get burned from all of that. And protein has the highest thermic effect of food when you compare it to the other macronutrients, carb and fat. So that's why it's believed that this can also be a mechanism for why a higher protein diet can lead to weight loss. So now let's get into some protein types and sources, and let's look at those intake trends. So protein quality is determined by amino acid composition and bioavailability. So essentially, the better that we digest it and absorb it, that's considered to be a higher quality protein. So there's that definition that I said was missing back when we were talking about the DRIs. So to recall, complete proteins are ones that contain all 9 essential amino acids, whereas incomplete proteins will lack 1 or more of those essential amino acids that our body needs. So like MyPlate says, though, it really is important for us to consume a variety of protein foods because all of these different protein foods and sources, they do have their own unique benefits. So I do think variety is really, really important. And there are limited studies to suggest that the protein source is important for those diabetes and weight-related outcomes that we were talking about. But there are some studies that have shown that complete protein, so the ones there on the left, have a greater effect on satiety and therefore would help more with weight loss. So there is some information there about that. So as we know, protein content varies widely across the types of foods. So we see here that meat and fish per serving has the highest amount of protein. And plant-based does not have quite as much, but of the plant-based protein sources, your soybeans and your lentils have the most per serving. Just wanted to kind of give you that snapshot there. And then let's look at some protein lingo on food labels. So you're going to see a lot of different types of nutrient content claims on packaging at stores, just like your patients are going to be seeing a lot of this. So let's define some of these. So in order for something to be called high protein on a food package, it has to contain 10 grams or more of protein per serving. So that's 20% or more of the daily value per RACC. So that stands for the reference amount customarily consumed. Or in other words, how much an average person is going to be expected to eat in a single sitting, right? So 10 grams or more. And I think a good example food for this is Greek yogurt. I've seen some Greek yogurts that will have that high protein written on there. And I think regular yogurt would be a good example food for something that's identified as a good source of protein because it doesn't have quite as much as Greek. It's going to be under that 10 gram mark. But most often you'll see regular yogurt containing more than 5 grams per serving. And then more protein, in order to be able to use that claim, the product needs to contain at least 5 grams more per serving than the regular version of that food. So I've seen shakes out there where there's maybe like standard nutrition shakes and then there's a protein version of that, and that's where you'll maybe see something like more protein written on it. And then you're likely familiar with the terms fortified and enriched. I feel like I've been seeing a lot of protein fortified foods on the market, such as like protein pancake and waffle mixes. I've seen protein potato chips and protein this or that. So it's definitely very much a buzz term amongst the food packages right now. So the International Food Information Council, or as I call them, IFIC, they conduct the Food and Health Survey every year. It's usually released in the month of May. And this includes a very representative sample of US adults. And they also recently conducted a survey on protein. So let's take a look at what those two surveys were saying about protein. So 59% of Americans are actively trying to consume protein and make sure that they get it in their diet. And the top reason for why they're wanting to get it in their diet is to ensure that they're eating a balanced diet, which is great. That's very encouraging as a dietitian to hear something like that. 3 in 4 Americans identify as omnivores, so they're eating both animal-based and plant-based proteins. And then dinner is the meal where most Americans are trying to get their protein in, which doesn't surprise me at all. I feel like personally I tend to eat the most meat at dinner. And then taste is a top consideration when choosing a protein food. So it outbeat cost, which is, shocking, honestly, during this economic climate that we have right now, that even taste is still beating out cost in terms of when making those protein choices. So people like their food nice and tasty. And then 3 in 10 Americans are eating more plant-based proteins. And this is not surprising to me because sustainability is very much top of mind, I think, for many people. And plant-based protein sources are considered to be more sustainable by many. So now let's look at how the protein intake has changed over time. So this is from 1999 to 2016. These researchers used 43,000 adults from the NHANES, and they used the 24-hour diet recalls from the study. And what they found was total animal and plant protein all increased from 1999 to 2016. And particularly for animal protein, there was a higher consumption of poultry and eggs. And for plant protein, there was a higher consumption of whole grains and nuts. Honestly, this doesn't surprise me at all, because I feel like in the 90s, there was a lot of fear around fat and especially eggs when I think of proteins. So there was a big fear of that. And, the more recent evidence showed hey, eggs are not harmful like we once thought, or fat's not as harmful. So because people are tending to consume less carbohydrate, I think that they're increasing their fat intake, and along with that, their protein intake. So I'm not shocked at all to see that we are consuming more protein overall as a country. The study authors reported that while macronutrient composition in the U.S. diet has improved, so they see this as an improvement, that we are still consuming too much added sugar and saturated fat, though. So they did make note in that study of that. So now we're going to pivot to talking about nutrition shakes. I mentioned shakes a couple of times earlier on in the presentation, and once was when we were discussing the Academy's newest guidelines on adult weight management approaches, and when I was talking about meal replacements. So I believe shakes can be a really great vehicle for increasing protein intake in your patients who have those diabetes and weight management goals. And so let's take a look at why that is. So a couple of years ago, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis on liquid meal replacements, and this was published in the ADA's journal Diabetes Care. The review consisted of almost 900 participants across 9 randomized control trials. And the interventions included either doing a liquid meal replacement as part of a comprehensive weight loss program, or it was just that traditional weight loss program or diet. And the mean calorie intake and macronutrient distribution for these was very close to being about the same, so very much comparable. And the results showed that the liquid meal replacement, in addition to the weight loss program, had more significant reductions in BMI, body fat, waist circumference, A1C, glucose, insulin, and blood pressure. So that is really interesting to me. And again, this was done in individuals who had overweight, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. So now let's look at different types of shakes. So that last study that I showed you, those studies included weight loss shakes and diabetes shakes. There's a lot of different shakes out on the market that your patients can choose from. You've probably seen many of them at the store. I feel like I see them sprinkled in different sections of the grocery store. Sometimes they're in the pharmacy section, depending on what shake it is, or sometimes they might be over, closer to where more like nutritional supplements are, or like vitamin area of the grocery store. So let's take a look at what those different shakes are. So standard shakes are more of that classic nutritional shake. It's often recommended to patients when appetite's poor, and they're just trying to boost their nutrition. And these shakes are usually a little higher in carb. I usually see them to be pretty low in fiber, if having any fiber in them. And then they have moderate levels of protein and fat. And then protein shakes, these are often used by athletes or people who are wanting to increase muscle mass. And they're typically very low in carb, might have moderate fiber in them, but very high in protein and low in fat. And then weight loss shakes usually have moderate levels of carb, fiber, and protein, and they're low in fat. So typically weight loss shakes are used as a direct meal replacement to help lower overall calorie intake and promote that weight loss, of course. And then finally, we have diabetes shakes. So diabetes shakes are designed to help manage blood sugar. I see them most often used as snack replacement, or they're paired with meals. They have balanced levels of carb, protein, and fat, but what differentiates them is that they do have a higher amount of fiber in there to help with that glycemic control. So let's look a little bit more at those diabetes-specific shakes, since that's a big part of our topic for today. So this study here, this was a systematic review and meta-analysis that was done to determine the benefits of nutritional shake formulas in patients who had type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So they included both diabetes types. And so this review included a total of 23 studies, and some of the shakes were taken in orally and some through tube feeding, and there was nearly 800 participants. And so they directly compared a standard nutrition formula with a diabetes-specific nutrition formula. And I showed this here in these pictures so you can kind of see what the difference is between those. And like I explained on the last slide, the diabetes-specific formulas have more of that inclusion of fiber in them. So the diabetes-specific formula, it had lower calories, lower carbs, it's higher in fiber, higher in protein, and higher in monounsaturated fat. And so what the study found was that the diabetes-specific shakes significantly reduced postprandial blood glucose rise compared to that standard formula, basically showing like, hey, these shakes are not just labeled diabetes to be labeled diabetes, they actually do have benefits for people who have diabetes. So this is another study that was done on diabetes-specific shakes. And this one here was a randomized clinical trial with 81 participants. And so there was a control group that did not consume any shakes. And then there were two other groups who each consumed 2 shakes. So in both groups, they consumed a shake for breakfast. But in one group, they also consumed a shake for an afternoon snack, and then the other group for a bedtime snack. And they tracked their blood glucose levels using a continuous glucose monitoring system. And what they found was consuming a shake for breakfast significantly improved morning blood sugar response. So it helps out with blood sugar in the morning. But there was a difference between the afternoon shake and the bedtime shake. The afternoon shake had more significant results in reducing nighttime glucose variability, also increased confidence in choosing foods, and then there were reduced food cravings in this group. So I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism was behind that, but I found that to be a really interesting study in showing those benefits of those diabetes shakes. So back to that IFIC survey that we were talking about earlier, like I had mentioned, dinner is the meal where most people are trying to get their protein in, and then the second most to that is the lunch meal. So and I just really want to call out from what we learned earlier on in the presentation, is that the diabetes group, remember, of those 3 glycemic groups, the diabetes group was the least likely to meet that RDA for protein. So even though they may be getting their protein at dinner, getting their protein at lunch, they're still not always hitting that RDA, that minimum recommendation. So how can they get that protein intake boosted? And so that's where I think a shake might be a really great thing to add into a daily eating pattern. And so I think breakfast, snacks, and desserts could be a good way to boost protein intake. Because if they're already getting it with dinner and lunch, these are good opportunities in those areas. So meal skipping, I do want to kind of pivot to that, because Breakfast, from what we've learned from studies, is a meal that is most often skipped. There are studies to show that. I read a study in young adults that said breakfast is this meal that's skipped most amongst that particular age group. But even anecdotally, when I would talk with my patients, of all the meals throughout the day, breakfast was the one most often skipped. And so that's, again, why I think a shake would be a very good opportunity to sub in for that meal, because having a nutrition shake for breakfast is better than having no breakfast at all, right? So let's talk about why meal skipping can be harmful. So particularly for breakfast, skipping that has been associated with overweight, obesity, or increased risk for overweight, obesity. And also, it's been found that when a person skips breakfast, they're more likely to consume calories later in the day, which makes complete sense. If you're not eating all morning, you might be picking up those calories at lunch and at dinner, or maybe even at bedtime. Also, it reduces overall diet quality, and people who skip breakfast tend to consume less fruit, whole grains, and dairy throughout the day. Dinner also has consequences with decreasing overall energy intake for the day, and then reducing diet quality. People who skip dinner tend to have less vegetables, beans, dairy, protein, and seafood. So both of these definitely have consequences, but breakfast is just an area that I've always just been a big proponent of making sure that the meal is not skipped, because I just most often hear that that is what the meal that is skipped throughout the day. So your patients can integrate these shakes in their eating patterns in a variety of ways. So when they can do this is when appetite may be poor. They just don't feel like eating something, like a traditional meal, or they may not have a taste for traditional protein foods. Like maybe they're just not in the mood for a piece of chicken or for an egg. It just doesn't sound good to them. Well, maybe something sweeter sounds good to them. So that's where a nutrition shake could be a really good option. It's also a great time when someone doesn't have time to prepare a meal or a snack. In the society that we live in, people are constantly on the go. And so it can be very hectic. So grabbing a shake can be an easy thing for them. Also, like I mentioned on the last slide, if they're tempted to skip a meal, having a shake, again, is better than not having anything at all. And so I would often grab a shake from the sample closet at my office and give it to a patient if I hear that they're skipping a meal. And again, like I had mentioned, on the go is a really good time to throw it in the purse and the backpack and take it with them. So how can they do this? How can they integrate the shake? So it could be a meal replacement potentially. It could be a snack replacement, or it could be as part of a meal to boost the nutrition of that meal. Maybe they love to just have cereal for breakfast. It's their thing. They like to have their whatever, their cornflakes or whatnot with breakfast. Well, that may not have enough nutrition for them to carry them throughout the day, so pairing that with a shake could be helpful. And then they could, like I said before, have it as a dessert or a sweet treat. These shakes usually come in some fun flavors. There's chocolate, strawberry, vanilla. There's all sorts of flavors, new flavors out there. And so they can kind of view this as something like that milkshake or that malt type of treat. I know my grandfather, he had type 2 diabetes, and he would use his vanilla nutrition shake sort of as that dessert, that treat. He would even pour it into a glass that looked like a 1950s diner shake glass and enjoy it with a straw, because it just kind of gave him that feel of a dessert. And then you could also use shakes as part of a recipe. So I have some inspiration here on this next slide. So you can essentially shake up your shake. So if your patient's already consuming caffeine in the morning, like maybe having a coffee or an espresso drink, they could add that coffee or that espresso to the shake and make sort of like an iced latte. They could also use it as a liquid in overnight oats. That might be a good option. They could blend the shake with ice to make a frozen drink. They can use it as part of a smoothie bowl. Smoothie bowls have become really popular, very trendy on social media. So they can use the shake as part of that bowl. They could freeze it into ice pops. With summer coming around the corner, it's going to be here before we know. I know it's turned to spring, but the way time goes, this could make a really nice summer treat. And then they could also pour it into a glass simply. That's like I was saying on the last slide, my grandpa used to do that, and it just kind of elevates it, makes it feel a little bit more premium, like a decadent dessert. So let's go over what we learned today. So as we've learned, protein recommendations, they vary widely across sources. And so your counseling, of course, should always be individualized to be able to pick that best protein recommendation for your patient. And then people with diabetes, remember, they are the least likely to meet that RDA for protein. And that has consequences on their diet quality and on their functional abilities. And so it's really, really important to focus on that population when it comes to protein. And then dietary protein, as we learned, it has minimal impact on glucose and insulin, but it can increase satiety and therefore help with weight loss. And to maximize nutritional benefits as recommended by MyPlate, consuming a variety of protein foods is best. And then finally, nutrition shakes, particularly diabetes-specific shakes, they can provide those additional benefits to your patients with diabetes, such as helping them with reducing weight and improving their glycemic outcomes. So thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy workday. And so Leslie, I'm going to kick it over to you because I believe we have some questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Holly. That was really great. Let's jump in. So the first question, have you noticed any differences in blood sugar results, I guess, from animal protein versus plant-based protein?
I can't say that I've personally studied or looked at those things head to head. Obviously, we do know that a lot of plant-based protein sources have carbohydrate in them. So it definitely needs to be considered when a patient is carb counting or considering that and if they're taking insulin or if they're, obviously counting their carbs. So I can't say that I've looked at that head to head, but I think that would actually make a really interesting research study.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. If you're recommending a weight loss shake as a meal replacement, do you have any insight on how to ensure that the patient is still learning healthful dietary habits and sustaining weight loss when the shake is eventually discontinued from the diet?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where the education really comes in. So I like to kind of look at these shakes as, I like to look at the nutrient profile on them, right? Look at the nutrition facts and kind of explain how that would translate to food for the patient. So saying something like, if a shake has, let's say 16 grams of protein in it, well, I would say to them, well, this is kind of like eating 2 ounces of meat, this is the equivalent to that, or if it has 15 grams of carbohydrate, it's like, oh, this is like eating a small apple, so it kind of puts that food aspect in their brain, and they're like, oh, okay, so this is like me eating 2 ounces of turkey with an apple and nuts, and it's like, okay, so that's how that works, so that they can start to learn how they could translate that into actual foods. I think that's just important, but it is always important to state to patients, hey, this may or may not be a long-term solution for you, but it's definitely something, if this is what you value and the approach that you want to take, if you want to use these shakes, I'm going to help you integrate these in the best way that you can.
Great. Okay. I'm glad actually you sort of went down that path of equating the grams of protein in a shake to sort of a piece of food, because Kristen has asked, is there a minimum number of grams of protein that you would suggest to promote satiety?
I don't have any kind of exact numbers on that. I'm trying to think back to some of the studies that I was looking at in particular, but actual grams, I mean, it's just going to vary so much based on the person, obviously what their goals are, how much they weigh. And so I can't say that there's a specific number of grams. I think we really know is that there is a specific number of grams for preventing protein deficiency, but for satiety necessarily, I don't know in grams. Now, going back to those ADA standards of care, that was earlier on in the presentation, let me pull that up. They did state that 15 to 20% of total calories, 20 to 30% of total calories is what can potentially improve satiety and thereby weight loss. So that's what they have on there. So I would look at it more in terms of the AMDR, in terms of percentages, and then you can convert that to grams for your patient. But that's what the ADA is stating, is 20 to 30% total calories.
Okay, that's fair enough. Great.
Yeah.
Shifting gears a little bit from Karen, is there anything different to consider about protein powders versus shakes for patients with diabetes?
I think it just is one more step for them because they have to do the mixing themselves, right? When you have a protein powder. And so I think a benefit to like a ready-to-drink shake is that they don't have to think about it. I'm always about reducing barriers for people because, I'm sure some of the nutrition professionals on this call know I've had patients that say microwaving is, a lot of work for them, or, even like reheating something. So, eliminating as many steps as we can is helpful for the patient. And it also can ensure that it's going to taste the right way, because it's depending on what you might mix the powder with, whether it's with water or milk, you might have to add additional things to it to get the flavor to where you want it to be. I think that could be the downside to powder. But in terms of like nutrition, they could be pretty comparable, right? But I think when it comes to convenience and taste, the ready to drink typically tends to go over better with patients in my own experience.
Yeah, I can see how that could be just the convenience factor alone. So, okay. So Margot is saying her husband has type 2 diabetes, and she's having trouble getting him to eat more protein. She thinks he's addicted to sweets. Who isn't? But her question is, would a diabetic shake encourage more sweet intake and keep him from avoiding whole foods? So I think maybe it's a question of, is drinking that shake going to satisfy his sweets craving, perhaps?
It's very much individualized. I think that could be a very subjective thing. There are studies that talk about sweet perception, and if you have something sweet, does it make you crave sweets more? But the overall body of evidence out there states that that's not necessarily true, that by having like sweet taste, you're going to want more. In fact, like I would argue that it would be the opposite, and it's going to provide that kind of satisfaction to him, especially if it tastes good. So you got to go out and trial with some of these. That's why samples are really helpful to have. Is because if you like the taste of it, you're going to be more successful. And so I think that, I don't know exactly, but that's what I do know.
Yep, absolutely. That was a little bit more of a specific, personalized question, but
Yeah.
All right, let's see. We have time for one or two more, I think. Okay, this one's from Amy. Would you recommend would you recommend diabetes shakes for children? And she's specifically saying children with type 1, but I think maybe just children with, any of the different types of diabetes. What are your thoughts on children and shakes?
There's no guidance against it for sure. It could be pretty, I think it could be a pretty tasty treat for kids. And this is actually something an area that we here at Splenda are trying to start to look at. We're going to be at some more children-focused events this year, and we're going to be kind of looking at that to see, if kids like something like this. But I definitely think that kids could really enjoy it. It could taste like, milk, a chocolate milk to them or a strawberry milk to them. But there's definitely all of the studies that have been done on nutrition shakes and people with diabetes, they've been done on adults. So I don't have any like specific evidence for the pediatric population, but there's no reason why they couldn't have a shake. It's definitely could be a really good option.
Great. Excellent. All right, Holly, well, we're at the top of the hour, so I just want to thank you for joining us. Thanks for sharing your expertise on this important topic. We always love working with you and hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
And so what's up next? What's coming up next for our webinars this week? We have another webinar happening tomorrow, Thursday, March 23rd from 2 to 3:30. It's called Nutritional Psychiatry, the Role of Food and Mental Health Treatment. This is an interprofessional webinar that's going to discuss the foundational elements of the food and mental health connection. Carmen Meyer and Lauren Clanton will detail strategies and discuss tools that will help you serve your patients more effectively, help you collaborate across the healthcare professions, and improve care for patients by using nutrition for better mental health. Register today at ce.todaysdietitian.com/nutritional psychiatry, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. The credit claiming email will be sent out to all attendees shortly, and it contains instructions on how to complete the webinar evaluation and download your certificate. And with that, we've come to the top of the hour. So thanks everyone again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our webinar tomorrow.